Fourth Crusade began with the call of Pope Innocent III from 1202-1204, with the aim of invading the Holy Land and recapturing Jerusalem. Due to internal conflicts between the monarchs and the Christian power centers and the interests of the Republic of Venice, the Fourth Crusade deviated from its original objective and led to the conquest and sack of the Hungarian city of Zadar, a city in present-day Croatia, and the Christian Constantinople, and the division of much of it, in which the Republic of Venice was able to exploit the religious motivations of the Crusaders for its own political and commercial purposes, and became the strongest trading power in the Mediterranean. In this exclusive episode, the motivations and causes, events, and factors, command and control and important battles of the Fourth Crusade of the series of Crusades will be described in detail. So stay with us in this Fourth Crusade. So let's start. After the defeat of the Kingdom of Jerusalem against Saladin Ayyubi and the failure of the Third Crusade to recapture the city of Jerusalem, Europeans had no enthusiasm for another war. But eventually, the French barons agreed to participate in another crusade. For this purpose, the Crusaders chose the sea route through the Mediterranean Sea. He made a deal with Enrico Dandolo, the ruler of the Republic of Venice, to provide the necessary ships. Enrico provided ships, but the Crusaders could not afford the heavy costs. Therefore, Dandolo asked them to attack the Hungarian port city of Zadar and bring it under the rule of the Republic of Venice in exchange for their debt. After invading and capturing Zadar, the Crusaders then realized that they still could not pay the rent for Dandolo's ships. Meanwhile, the exiled prince of Byzantium, Alexios IV, asked the Crusaders to pay off their debt to the Republic of Venice, if they gave him the rulership of the Empire of Constantinople. For this reason, the Crusader leaders decided to go to Constantinople. After attacking the city, they succeeded in placing Alexios IV on the throne, but he refused to pay more than half the price. Then he was deposed from the kingdom due to the opposition of the people of Constantinople. After a series of misunderstandings and battles, the Crusaders finally captured Constantinople in 1204, looting and killing many of the city's inhabitants. As a result of this event, the Crusaders established a state called the Latin Empire, with the capital as the city, which lasted for half a century. In other territories left by Byzantium, 3 independent kingdoms of Greek origin were established. A portion of the properties and lands of the Byzantine Empire were also given to the Republic of Venice. Thus, Venice overthrew its rival and became the greatest trading power in the Mediterranean. Also, due to the blow the Byzantine Empire received from this war, it never regained its former position and fell into a position of weakness, and was eventually defeated by the Ottoman Turks. From a theological point of view, these events are considered the final point of the Great Schism between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. Factors and circumstances of the Fourth Crusade. Failure of the Third Crusade. In 1099, after the capture and sack of Jerusalem during the First Crusade, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was established. By 1187 CE, the Ayyubid Sultan Saladin had conquered a large part of the state of Jerusalem, including the city of Jerusalem. In addition to ruling Egypt and Syria, Salah al-Din Ayyubi led the Great Jihad against the Crusaders. With the conquest of Jerusalem, European Catholic governments once again felt a wave of fear. Therefore, with Saladin's extensive conquests in Palestine, the territory of the Crusader states was limited to the three regions of Tyre, Tripoli, and the Principality of Antioch on the Mediterranean coast. During the Third Crusade, of 92 to 1189, the Crusaders recaptured a large portion of the territory of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, including the important cities of Acre and Jaffa, but they failed to recapture Jerusalem. In 1195, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI launched a new crusade, and in the summer of 197, led by 2 archbishops, 9 bishops, and 5 dukes, a large number of German knights and nobles marched to Palestine by sea. After reaching the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, they conquered Sidon and Beirut, but en route, upon hearing of Henry's death, many nobles and clergy returned to Europe. The rest of the soldiers also returned to their ships in Tyre after a while. Thus, their campaign came to an end. Crusade Call. Shortly after his appointment, Pope Innocent III, 1216 to 1098, announced a new call to crusade. Innocent, who had succeeded in increasing the power and influence of the Latin Church, sought to recapture and regain control of the land of Palestine, especially the city of Jerusalem. He believed that the entire Christian world should be mobilized to achieve this goal. So he ordered everyone to prepare for war and collect donations in all the churches. However, Pope Innocent faced the same problems as Gregory VIII when he called for the Third Crusade. Once again, the kings of England and France were at war with each other. Richard I was busy recapturing the lands that Philip II had acquired in his absence while he was engaged in the Third Crusade. Although Richard was eager to return to the eastern Mediterranean, he did not want to leave France until he had regained the lands he claimed and punished Philip. The Holy Roman Empire was also divided between 2 contenders for power, Philip of Swabia and Otto of Brunswick, and was in worse shape. Thus, many warriors in Europe were engaged in war with each other. Unless there was peace and tranquility in the West, this crusade was not possible. Innocent therefore sent representatives to conflict zones to negotiate peace and ceasefire. In France, Richard received Cardinal Peter Capano. He insisted that Richard make peace with Philip, so that he or his men would march east. But Richard indignantly declared that, had Philip's treachery not been involved, he would have remained in the Holy Land and by now occupied Jerusalem. But in his absence, the Church had taken no action to prevent Philip from betraying Richard. Although negotiations with Richard failed at first, his efforts eventually led to a 5-year peace treaty between France and England. But in March of 1199, while surveying one of his castles, Richard was shot by an arrow and died of gangrene a month later, leaving the Crusaders desperate to achieve their goal. Despite these events, the new crusade was made possible by the actions of 2 people. The first was an influential preacher named Fouquet Noailles, who inspired people around France to wage jihad against the Muslims. And another, a nobleman named Theobald III Champagne, was the vector of Henry of Champagne. After the death of Conrad of Montferrat in 1192, Henry of Champagne ruled the Kingdom of Jerusalem until his death in 1197. He was a worthy knight. He announced during a ceremony that from now on he would draw his sword to serve God. Thus a large number of those present, such as Louis Count Balois, followed suit and took the oath of crusade. In February 1200, Baldwin Count of Flanders and his wife, Mary, received the cross, joined by other Flemish nobles. Although Theobald, Louis, and Baldwin were not kings, they were the three most powerful kingmakers in France. And besides, all three of them were young and eager to finish Richard's work in the East. As early as 1200 AD, a council of famous Crusaders was convened at Soissons. At this council, the timeline and goals of the new crusade were discussed. At the same meeting, they agreed not to take a land route into the Byzantine Empire and to take a sea route like Richard and Philip. Unlike King Richard of England, none of these feudal lords owned a large fleet. So they decided to contract with one of the shipping ports to receive the ship. A committee was therefore appointed to plan and execute the plan for procuring ships and moving them to the best ports. Treaty of Venice. The committee eventually chose the Republic of Venice, knowing that it had a long history of crusades and the resources to support a large fleet for war. During the winter of 1200, these delegates crossed the Alps and made their way to Venice. The Republic of Venice was then controlled by Enrico Dandolo, who was very old and blind. Negotiations between the parties began with the arrival of representatives led by Geoffrey de Villehardouin. He asked Enrico to look with compassion on the land of Christ, i.e. Palestine, and help him in this holy work. The delegates then shared with Enrico their decision to take up the cross and follow Richard's military plan to invade Egypt before conquering Jerusalem. But the purpose of the crusade had to be kept secret because the Baron feared that the common soldiers would oppose him. Enrico agreed and promised to do everything in his power to win the consent of the Venetians. After some negotiation, the Republic of Venice finally agreed to provide 200 ships for 1 year to carry 33,500 Crusaders, including 4,500 knights and their horses, 9,000 knight servants, and 22,000 foot soldiers for 85,000 silver marks. In addition, the Venetians agreed to give the Crusaders a 50-man warship free of charge on the condition that they share equally in the booty. As planned, the fleet was to depart on 29 June 1202. The delegates also enthusiastically signed the agreement, and it was later ratified by the Pope. Meanwhile, Theobald III of Champagne fell ill and died shortly thereafter. So the Crusaders handed over the leadership of the Crusader forces to Boniface Montferrat, brother of Conrad of Montferrat, the former king of Jerusalem, who was killed by the Nazarenes. The problem with this treaty was that the Crusaders did not know how to deal with large numbers. The King of France, Philip II, took only 650 knights and 1,300 foot soldiers with him to the Third Crusade, and he kept a maximum force of between 7,000 and 12,000 in France to defend his territory. Also, the 85,000 silver marks promised by the Crusaders was equivalent to about 20 tons of silver and twice the annual income of each king of France or England. Although Enrico Dandolo was blind and over 80 years old, he was an able leader, a sharp negotiator, and more distinguished than any of Europe's highest feudal lords. so he must have anticipated that the Crusaders would not be able to pay their debts and would forever be subject to the Venetian religion. After the treaty was signed between representatives of the Crusader leaders and Enrico Dandolo, many Crusaders were suspicious of the treaty because, according to the terms of the treaty, they saw it as a form of handing over the leadership of the Crusaders to the Venetians, who the Venetians wanted to use for their own purposes. So, people like Bishop Eaton and Reynold Hampery signed separate treaties with other ports as well, and sailed to Acre via ports like Marseille. The forces included a group that did not agree with the invasion of Egypt, as they carried crosses to march to the Holy Land and recapture Jerusalem. The Venetians, who were negotiating with the Ayyubid Sultan al-Adil at the time of the treaty with the Crusaders, also agreed to stop the Crusaders from doing so in exchange for not supporting the Crusaders in a war with Egypt and seizing Egypt's maritime borders. Trade with Europe fueled this discontent among the Crusaders to invade Egypt. And succeeded in dissuading the Crusaders from invading Egypt and leading them to meet their demands as per the provisions of the Treaty of Venice. Even according to Arnauld, the Venetians received huge bribes to dissuade the Crusaders from attacking the Holy Land in Palestine. Now it is not known whether the Crusaders were aware of the tricks of the Venetians or not. But if they knew that the Venetians wanted to deceive them, there was nothing they could do about it. For the treaty made with Venice practically put the Crusaders in possession of Venice, for the Crusaders were unable to supply 85,000 silver marks according to the conditions of Europe. In addition, some of the Crusader leaders such as Boniface and Dandolo had quarrels, which led to the fact that the leadership and control of the forces was actually in the hands of the Venetians, which was revealed during the attack on the Venetians. The beginning of the campaign and the problems of the Crusaders. Enrico Dandolo's address to the Crusaders in Venice. With the treaty concluded, the Crusaders prepared to head for the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. First, the Venetians prepared all their forces for war and stopped all their commercial activities and forced all merchant ships into the service of the Crusaders. In addition, many ships were built and stores of grain and food were provided by the Venetians for the Crusaders. The Venetians, with all their pains, completed their task, and thus the largest fleet in Europe, since ancient Rome was ready to take the forces of the Fourth Crusade, now across the Mediterranean to Egypt. But the Crusaders, like the Venetians, could not keep their promises. According to the treaty, the Crusaders were to pay the Venetians in 4 installments for the delivery of the fleet by April 1202. But when the First Crusade reached Venice in June of that year, they paid only a fraction of the said amount. However, although the fleet was scheduled to depart on June 29th, only one group of Crusaders reached Venice on that date. Even the papal representatives did not arrive in Venice until July 22nd. Thus, it became clear that the Crusaders were in deep trouble. The treaty stipulated that each Crusader should bring money with him based on his financial ability to cover the expenses of the expedition. But despite the presence of about 11,000 men, 1/3 of the expected force, only 1/3 of the required cost was raised. Enrico could not depreciate his fleet, as it would have cost the Venetians too much financially. And since Venice was a republic, Enrico could not finance the Crusaders' debt by taxing its citizens. In the end, the Crusaders could only provide 51,000 silver marks, 34,000 marks short of the stipulated amount. Thus, the Crusaders camped at Lido, a barren island near Venice, and spent difficult weeks waiting for the funds necessary to travel to the Holy Land. In August, Enrico met with the Crusade leaders. During this meeting, he noted that the Venetians had fulfilled their obligations and had thus far shown patience and demanded payment of debts from the Crusaders. The Crusader leader, who had agreed with Enrico Dandello, sent word to his soldiers to collect the remaining money, but despite the Crusaders' efforts, the required amount could not be collected, adding to the chaos. Attack on Zadar. Conquest of Zadar by the Crusaders. Enrico arranged a meeting with the Council of Counts to discuss the dire situation. The Crusaders, who had given away all their possessions, could no longer pay the remaining debts. So the council suggested another solution. At that time, the city of Zadar, located on the Dalmatian coast, had revolted against Venetian rule. And the Venetians' attempts to recapture the city were also futile. He said that if the Crusaders helped the Venetians subjugate Zadar, the Venetians would defer payment of the Crusaders' debt, so that they could pay off the debt later through the spoils of war. Thus, the Crusaders could spend the winter in Zadar and go to Egypt in the spring. According to Will Durant, Enrico offered that Venice would waive the remaining debt if the Crusaders helped capture the port of Zadar. The Crusader leaders were excited by the Venetians' proposal. Crusaders were concerned about shedding the blood of their co-religionists in their own hands. With mixed feelings, the Crusader leaders finally accepted the Venetian proposal. At the beginning of October 1202, a large fleet of Crusaders was ready to depart. Enrico was also ready to support the Crusaders in this war. After pledging allegiance and military support, the huge fleet headed for the Dalmatian coast. On October 10th, the ships anchored off the coast of Zadar and prepared to lay siege after the Crusaders landed. The people of Zadar, unable to face the Crusaders, sent representatives to negotiate terms of surrender with Enrico. Enrico agreed to the proposal of Zadar's representatives and then separated from them to discuss the matter with the Crusader leaders. But in Enrico's absence, Simon Montfort, who was opposed to changing the route to Zadar, negotiated with the representatives and informed the people of Zadar of the friendship and companionship of the Crusaders, especially the French. So the representatives returned to the city. On the other hand, the Pope threatened that whoever attacked Zadar would be excommunicated. When Enrico returned with the barons and Crusader leaders, Simon and Guy de Cerny read the Crusader leaders a papal letter against the Crusaders' attack on the city of Zadar. The Crusader leaders, who were in a difficult situation, considering their promise to the Venetians and knowing Simon's unreasonable objections, announced that they would help the Venetians in attacking and conquering Zadar. Simon separated from the main army with his troops and separated his camp from them. The Crusaders attacked the city with all their might, and the townspeople hung a cloth with a cross on the city wall to mark that the city was under the Pope's protection. But finally, the city surrendered after a week. After capturing the city, the Crusaders plundered the city and divided all the booty between the Franks and the Venetians. Thus, the Venetians were able to exploit the Crusades against their rival, the Kingdom of Hungary, for control of the Adriatic Sea. After the fall of Zadar, the Fourth Crusade was cancelled by the Pope. The French Crusaders immediately sent representatives to Rome to apologize to the Pope. Because of their remorse and apology, Pope Innocent also rescinded the decree of annulment of the Fourth Crusade and pardoned all the Crusaders. But the Venetians refused to admit their guilt. This led to the Pope formally excluding the Venetians, who made up half the army, from the crusade. but he allowed the Franks to continue their journey with them. At the same time, the Crusaders refused to accept the Pope's request to return Zadar's booty and left it in their custody. Treaty of Alexios Angelios with the Crusaders. Now the Crusaders belatedly prepared to depart. The Tuan leaders received an offer. Alexios Angelios, the refugee prince of Byzantium, sent representatives to the Crusader barons asking them to help them. Help was to remove his father, Isaac II, from the kingdom by his uncle, Alexis III. After defeating Isaac, Alexius III imprisoned his brother and nephew, Alexius Angelus Zadar. But the young prince escaped from prison and took refuge at the court of Philip of Swabia. He now asked the Crusaders to help him to achieve his goal of wresting power from his uncle. He assured the Crusader leaders that in exchange for the throne, he would give the Crusaders a large reward and help them travel to Egypt. An attractive proposition for the Crusaders, and a great way to save the Crusaders from financial trouble. On January 1, 2003, on behalf of Alexios Angelios, the Swabians, the representative of Philip, Holy Roman Emperor, and his wife Irene Angelina, sister of Alexios Angelios, arrived in Zadar. After telling the story of the Alexius III rebellion, he asked the Crusaders to help the Byzantine prince and help him ascend to the throne. Alexios Angelios also promised that in return for this service and assistance, he would subjugate the Greek Church to the Roman Church and join the crusade with an army of 10,000 men. In addition, he would place 500 knights permanently in the Holy Land. And pay 200,000 silver marks. The offer of silver marks was very attractive to the Crusaders, as the contract with the Venetians for the transport of the Crusaders was due to expire in June, and they had not yet paid their first year's debt. If they helped Alexis to his throne, they could pay off their debt and strengthen the Crusader army for their mission in the East. Despite all the attractiveness of the proposal, most Crusaders were reluctant to accept it, because they did not want to provoke the Pope's anger again. The army had been delayed by now, and most of them were tired of waiting any longer. This time, too, the Pope threatened the Crusaders that if they attacked Constantinople, he would expel them. But like the attack on Zadar, this threat was not accepted by the majority of the army. Boniface of Montferrat, Baldwin Flanders, Louis of Blois, and Hugh St. Paul signed a treaty in which the Crusaders promised to assist Alexios Angelios in overthrowing the Byzantine Empire without the support of regular troops. This decision was strongly opposed. Hundreds of people left the army in anger and headed for the Holy Land. Hundreds of others left the fight and went back to their homelands, and those who remained were in no way united, integrated, and connected with each other. Although the regular troops finally agreed to turn to Constantinople, they insisted on staying there only a short time, and then moving quickly to the eastern Mediterranean. According to Lane, although joining Byzantium in the war against the Ayyubids may have been a strategic justification for Constantinople's change of course, personal ambitions and relationships also seem to have been involved. Boniface of Montferrat, the commander of the Crusades, was the brother of Conrad of Montferrat. Conrad had ties to the Byzantine Empire in the past, which led Boniface to feel that he had a right to a part of that empire. In addition, Boniface was a friend of Emperor Philip of Swabia, the husband of Alexius's sister. Thus, it is likely that Alexis met with Boniface of Montferrat and Philip of Swabia before meeting with the Crusaders. This change of approach was precisely in line with the Venetians' interests in gaining a privileged position in Byzantium. The first attack on Constantinople and the enthronement of Alexios Angelos. On October 1st, 1202, the Crusaders and Venetians set sail with a fleet of 480 ships. Amid the excitement of the people and clergy, on April 20th, 1203, the Crusaders left for the island of Corfu, where they awaited the arrival of Alexios Angelos. At first, the island had good relations with the Greeks, but when the islanders learned of the Crusaders' intentions, relations changed. As soon as the imperial claimants reached Corfu, the Byzantines began attacking Venetian ships. The Crusaders responded by destroying the island. Pope Innocent III, who had previously met with Alexius and refused to respond to his request, wrote to Boniface that the Crusaders should not involve themselves in Alexius's plans. But when the Pope learned that the Crusaders had disobeyed his orders, he was furious and wrote a stern letter to the Crusaders, forbidding them to travel to Byzantium. But regardless of the Pope's letter, the Crusader fleet continued unopposed in the Sea of Marmara and the Aegean. On June 23rd, he entered the Bosporus Strait, and there he saw for the first time Constantinople and its great walls beyond the imagination of the Crusaders. The Crusaders, not deeming it necessary to attack the city immediately, camped in the gorge and awaited the expected popular uprising to overthrow the usurping emperor. But that didn't happen. So they waited for the right opportunity. Before attacking the city, he made a peace treaty with the Seljuk Sultan Suleiman II of Rome, stipulating that after the end of the war in Constantinople, the Seljuks would allow the Crusader forces to pass through their borders to Jerusalem, and in addition, the Seljuks pledged not to intervene in the war against Constantinople in favor of Byzantium. After a week of waiting, when there was no rebellion in the city, Enrico and Boniface Montferrat, with their ships, approached the city. In front of the people standing on the city walls, they raised young Alexius and loudly proclaimed their goodwill. The townspeople responded by cursing and pelting them with stones. Such ideas of the Crusaders regarding the ease of conquering Constantinople were destroyed and put the Crusaders in trouble once again, because the contract to transport the Crusaders had expired and the Crusaders had not yet paid their debt. On June 5th, the Crusaders crossed the strait and the knights attacked the outskirts of Galata. Although the Byzantine troops were outnumbered, they were not as effective as the Crusaders, so the chain-protected Galata soon lost its resistance to naval attacks, and the Venetian ships captured the port. A few days later, on July 18th, the Crusaders launched a two-pronged attack on the northwest side of the city. The knights on their horses concentrated their attack on a small part of the walls on the landward side, and the Venetians turned their ships into siege engines, targeting the walls on the seaward side. Despite these attacks, the Crusaders could not withstand the warlike defenders and were forced to retreat. But with Enrico's courage and tact, the Venetians managed to reach the shore and, under a shower of arrows and stones, advanced to parts of the wall and capture 25 towers. Enrico Dandolo then created a barrier by setting fire to nearby buildings, preventing a Byzantine counterattack. In the end, however, all the Crusaders and the Venetians retreated. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios III, politically defeated despite his military superiority and enraged by the people, fled the city during the night. So that Isaac could return to power. As Isaac took control of the government, he sent emissaries to the Crusaders to inform the Crusaders of what was happening. The Crusaders feared that Isaac would not accede to their demands when he returned to power. So they sent their representatives to the court with the treaty signed by Alexios Angelios and asked Isaac to confirm it. Crusade attack on Constantinople in 1203. The gates of the city were opened to the Crusaders for the first time with the beginning of the reign of Alexios IV. Alexios paid half of his promise and agreed to pay the rest in installments. He fulfilled the rest of his promises, and in a letter addressed to Pope Innocent, he declared his obedience to the Catholic Church, and in another letter reminded the Sultan of Egypt that he intended to join the Crusaders in conquering the lands previously held by Christians. But gradually, Alexios was unable to pay the rest of his debt. Therefore, he began confiscating the estates of his uncle, Alexios III, exhuming the jewels inside the tombs of previous emperors, and seizing the church's precious jewels and vessels. But due to these actions, he faced severe reactions from people. Alexios, who did not want a public revolt against him and did not want to lose the confidence of the Crusaders, proposed to the Crusader leaders that they stay in the city for the winter so that they could pay off their debt during the sailing season. Despite initial opposition, the Crusaders eventually acceded to the Byzantine Emperor's request. But in time, according to the words of Alexios's advisors, he decided not to pay the Crusaders anymore. Therefore, in August 1203, he severed his contacts and did not even pay the installments. After these situations, the Crusaders looted various buildings, including churches, and a big fire was also started in one of the lootings, which caused a lot of damage to the city. By November 1203, the Crusader leaders had learned that they could not get their money. For this reason, he sent representatives to the court of Constantinople to remind Alexios of his great services and sure promises, to which the young emperor reacted negatively. Alexios, who had failed to drive out the Crusaders, faced protests from his people, who demanded a new emperor to solve the problems. They chose first Nicholas Canibas and then Ducas Mortsoflos. Mortsophilos succeeded in imprisoning the young emperor in a coup d'état before the Crusaders and was enthroned as the new emperor under the title Alexios V. Conquest of Constantinople by the Crusaders in 1204. After the coup, Mortsophilos was crowned Alexios V on 5 February 1204. At the beginning of his work, to get rid of the Crusaders, he organized an attack against them. But despite an early lead, he eventually relented and agreed to negotiate with Enrico. The two met after a few days to find a peaceful solution to the problem. Enrico told Alexios V that the Crusaders would never recognize him and asked him to release Alexios IV so that he could fulfill his promise and pay his debt, which Mortsophilos refused. On the excuse that the Crusaders were leaving, he ordered that Alexios be hanged the next day. With the death of Alexios, their pretext for staying in Constantinople ended. In March, the common soldiers demanded to reach the Holy Land, and the Crusader leaders were bound by the aforementioned oath to provide travel facilities for them, but they could not do so. The Crusader leaders did not have the money to hire ships from the Venetians, which Alexios IV had signed and not paid for. Their supplies were also scanty, for they had plundered for miles on the outskirts of the city. Boniface Montferrat, therefore, did not agree to leave Constantinople without success. So Boniface, with the help of bishops and monks, declared with the army that Murtzophalos was a murderer and unfit to rule, and that the Byzantines had actually conspired with him by accepting him. In addition, the Greek Church disobeyed the orders of the Roman Church. Thus, the necessary pretext for war against Constantinople was provided. The Crusaders were ready to proceed with their fleet to the port of Constantinople. Seeing the vulnerability of the Golden Horn region, the Crusaders began their attacks from the region on 8 April. But the strong wind made the Crusader ships unable to stay close to the wall, and the Crusaders retreated with heavy casualties. With the first retreat, the morale of the Crusaders became even lower, and they even declared that they were not ready to stay in Byzantium any longer. But with the speech of Boniface and Daedalus, the army was once again, according to Daedalus's plan. The ships were tied up in pairs, so that the attack would be more effective and successful. On April 11th, the soldiers were summoned en masse, during which the priests tried to incite the Crusaders with fiery speeches, declaring that the Byzantines were nothing but infidels. So, on April 12, 1204, the Crusader forces once again attacked Constantinople. Fighting continued for almost the whole day, but the Crusaders gained nothing. Although the Crusaders managed to capture several towers atop the walls, they were so surrounded by the Byzantines that they were unable to advance. But a small group of Crusaders managed to enter the city behind the Byzantine forces, and after a surprise attack from the rear, they forced the Byzantine forces to flee, leaving the rear of the city's defenders empty. Thus, the Byzantine army was gradually defeated, with the main army on the run. Murtzophalos could only rely on the Varangian guard's zipper, but that was not enough. The people also stopped helping him fight the Crusaders and tried to surrender the city to Boniface. Now, unable to defend the city on his own, he thought it best to flee. Destruction of Constantinople and end of the war. On the morning of April 13th, Boniface was met by a delegation of dignitaries and clergy who presented him with the keys to the city. After capturing the city, the Crusaders began looting the city, which lasted for 3 days and resulted in the theft or destruction of all Greco-Roman artifacts. Many Byzantine citizens were killed, and all their property was confiscated. The Crusaders attacked the altars in the synagogues, stole the sacred objects, and destroyed all the silver and precious stone statues. According to sources, the Crusaders obtained 900,000 silver marks from the looting of the city, which they divided among themselves. The Venetians received 150,000 marks, the Crusaders received 50,000 marks, and the rest of the wealth was divided between the Crusaders' regulars and knights. In addition to plundering the city, the conquering forces satisfied their lust with the surrendered women of Constantinople. Women were raped in public places like streets and squares, and even in churches. Old women were also disrespected and driven naked in the streets, and the men who resisted protecting the women were brutally killed. According to whom, the servants of Christ, instead of using their weapons against the infidels, washed their swords in the blood of Christians. He did not care about people's religion, gender, or age. He did not spare even nuns and elderly women and insulted their dignity in public. The conquest of Constantinople is considered one of the most profitable conquests in history. Although plundering a city that stood firm in the face of the conquerors was acceptable in terms of medieval morality, it is clear that the Crusaders plundered too much, contrary to their oath and threat of excommunication. They shamelessly attacked the shrines of the Byzantine Christians, looting everything of value and destroying what was untouched. When Pope Innocent learned of the Crusaders' actions, he was ashamed and severely rebuked them. Fourth Crusade in the Levant. A group of Crusaders, including Simon Montefort, Earl Pagem of Leicester, and Renard de Secco of Dampierre Asthenius, separated from the main army and sailed directly from Italian ports to the Holy Land. These soldiers were few in number, but their presence and actions greatly contributed to the stability of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and even led to the expansion of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. More than half of the knights who took the cross at L'Occitan reached Acre, including about 300 knights, a large number of foot soldiers, and a large number of other soldiers who arrived in the Holy Land. With the arrival of these new forces, a heated situation arose in the region, the most important of which was the Antiochian Succession War. The fire of this war, which had been dormant for some time, was rekindled by the sudden invasion of Leo I, king of Seleucia. The incident occurred when a group of Armenian forces attacked Yezir Hadid near Antakya. Although local commanders and governors tried to resolve the issue before the arrival and intervention of the Crusaders, the task was not completed, and eventually papal representatives. Sophrad, the king of Jerusalem, and Cyprus Emery, leaders of the Knights Templar and Hospitaller, local governors and barons, entered the issue. However, all efforts to secure peace were in vain, and the war continued until the victory of Bohemond IV of Antioch. With a peace treaty between the parties, the war ended between the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Ayyubids. It was not logical for the Crusaders to start a new war against the Ayyubids. However, this treaty was mostly for the southeastern and southern regions of the empire, not the north, because at that time, Hospitaller's forces in Tripoli and northern areas also clashed with the Ayyubid border posts. On 16 May 1203, these small skirmishes led to a major clash in the area of Bahrain between the Hospitaller forces and the forces of Tripoli on the one hand, and the Ayyubid forces of Baalbek on the other, resulting in a Muslim victory. This was followed by another skirmish between the Muslim and Christian forces on 3 June, which resulted in a Muslim victory. After the defeat of the Hospitaller forces, the commanders appealed to the Ayyubid ruler of Homs for peace, and received a negative response. The Crusaders wanted to fight the Ayyubid forces, but Bohemond's conflict with Leo I forced them not to take action against the Ayyubid forces. At that time, the Crusader forces were on the field, facing a confrontation between Bohemond and Laval. However, Renard's men, who had just arrived from Europe, launched separate and independent attacks against the Muslims. Reynard attacked Latakia as the first step bite. He believed he had enough strength and men to conquer the city, but he failed before the Muslim forces. Reynard himself was captured and many of his soldiers were killed or captured. However, in late 1203, Reynard, along with the rest of the captured commanders and several knights, was released by Hospitaller forces and returned to his kingdom. After that, peace was also made between the Muslims and the Hospitaller forces. With the arrival of 1204, the peace treaty between the Ayyubids and the Kingdom of Jerusalem collapsed, and the Crusaders took the initiative and attacked the city of Fourth on the Nile Delta. In response to this attack, the Ayyubid navy also attacked ships carrying Crusader arms and supplies off the coast of Cyprus without the permission of the Ayyubid Sultan al-Adil, and responded to the Crusader attack. Armed conflicts continued on land and sea, until Emery, king of Cyprus and Jerusalem, officially announced on September 10 that the peace treaty with the Muslims had ended. So he sent most of his troops to Galilee. The Crusaders' surprise attack on Hama and the defeat of the city's defenders led to another peace treaty between the Crusaders and the Ayyubids, during which the Ayyubids ceded lands such as Jaffa, Ramallah, Nazareth, and Sidon to the Crusaders. Although these battles were somewhat successful for the Crusaders, this success was due to the Ayyubids' own weakness, not the strength of the Crusaders. However, the successes of this battle were overshadowed by the dark operations of the Crusaders in Constantinople. Fate of the people involved in the war. During this looting and subsequent events, many important Greek and Byzantine figures were killed or exiled. First, Alexios III betrayed Alexios V and provided the means for his assassination and death by the Latins. But later, he was arrested by Boniface and exiled to southern Italy and finally executed in 1211. With the exception of a small number of Crusaders, they achieved their main objective, that of reaching the Holy Land in the Levant. After sacking Constantinople, the rest left for their city and home. Enrico Dandolo, old and ill, died in Venice in May 1205 after the end of the Fourth War. And on September 4th, 1207, Boniface was also killed in an attack by the Bulgarians.